incident outcomes. They aren't part of the decision-making process when deciding on what penalties to dole out. Yeah, right. Kia ora, my name's Kimmy and I talk about Formula 1 in the world's second worst accent, and these are my 3 conclusions following the 2025 Canadian Grand Prix. Before I get into the details of my penalty gripes, I'm going to first talk about George Russell. And yeah, I know there's at least one person out there hanging out for my opinion on the whole max of it all, but I'm sorry, I'm going to have to disappoint. At this point in the season, with 10 races down and 14 to go, it's hard to argue that George Russell isn't still an outside chance for taking the driver's title this year. And considering we were all still talking about Lando Norris being a genuine threat to Max Verstappen late in the 2024 season, despite the points deficit being one nobody had ever overcome before, I think counting out George would be foolish. Let's take a look at where we're at. We have 2 McLarens who just had their first real on-track incident that resulted in a race-ending crash for one of them, which shows that the number 1 might publicly be the team, but once those visors come down, the media platitudes become little more than lip service. We have a Mercedes that people are underestimating in the warmer temperatures because everyone seems to have forgotten that just because a car's ideal operating window might be certain conditions, it doesn't preclude them from performing well at others. And the Merc has been more than just a cold weather specialist for a wee while now. And finally, we have George Russell himself, who really seems to have found his groove and is performing at an extremely high level without the silly mistakes that have cost him big time in the past. I mean, deliberate corner cutting notwithstanding. Now at the moment, Russell is 62 points behind Piastri in the driver's standings, which sounds like a lot, but considering there's 3 guys ahead of him, all of whom will be looking to take points off one another at every opportunity, no matter what McLaren says about their rules of engagement. All it would really take is for a few McLaren DNFs, some Red Bull disasters, and consistent high point scoring finishes along with a couple of wins for George to be fighting right up there at the front. And considering the Mercedes seems to have taken a step forward this weekend after taking off their new rear suspension, reworking it, and then bolting it back on for Canada, I think we need to expect the Mercs to be fighting at the sharp end a lot more frequently. Now, considering they tested the suspension in Imola and then took it off for Monaco and Spain, and Imola does, let's be honest, share a fair few characteristics with Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, I think it's fair to assume that Mercedes were targeting Canada as a potential opportunity. But whatever they've done seems to have made their tyres less prone to overheating than that of their competitors. After all, Kimi Antonelli also ran a flawless race despite often being in the wake of other cars. Now, to be fair, the car could be flattered by adjustments to the ride height to allow for the level of curb riding needed around Montreal, but I said it earlier this year and I'll still say it. Keep a close eye on George. And I mean, heck, if the McLarens routinely start taking each other out, this might end in a Russell-Verstappen title fight. And I bet we'd all love to see that. Next up, we're going to have a wee chat about Ferrari and the fact that Fred Vasseur's role seems to be genuinely at risk. And I didn't think that at the start of the weekend, but by the end of it, I am starting to lean into that byline. Now, I know that the Italian media is notoriously cutthroat when it comes to Ferrari's performance to the point where they seem to take it every failure personally, but you kind of can't ignore it. The problem with publications like Gazzetta running headlines like what we've seen this past week or so is that they generate negative sentiment and they whip everyone into a frenzy, and even though there's likely to always be an element of truth in there, they do tend to become, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Make the Tifosi mad, make the media start asking more uncomfortable questions, pile on the pressure, and when things don't miraculously turn around at the next race, start calling for heads. It's the routine they've been doing for decades now, and it's the routine they continue to do. And so we end up in another situation where a Ferrari team principal looks like their contract won't be renewed after giving them nowhere near enough time to fix the problem that is really just Ferrari itself. Ferrari exists in a strange space in Formula 1. They're the only team who's been a stalwart on the grid since the championship's inception, and they get an additional payment every year on top of the standard prize money because of this historic status. And they're one of only 2 teams not to have a base in the UK. Even Racing Bulls has moved most of their operations to Milton Keynes now. Formula 1 is very much a category of motorsport where anyone coming up in the industry, whether that be as a mechanic or an engineer or leadership or a machine technician or a strategist or any number of other roles, well, they all know they might likely end up working in the UK, and they're probably more than likely preparing themselves for that as they're working towards getting their foot in the door. Things like putting your energy into learning English rather than Italian, making friends, settling in the UK, which tends to come with things like putting down roots there with your family. Ferrari, in its doggedly determined stance to remain firmly Italian while kind of admirable, puts itself at a disadvantage when it comes to recruitment. New hires either already need to speak Italian or they need to learn it, and they need to uproot their families to an unfamiliar country and send their kids to school somewhere where they don't speak the language, or instead they need to spend massive amounts of time away from home even if they're not someone who regularly attends Grand Prix weekends. And the fact that Ferrari failed to land Adrian Newey, I think, tells a little bit of a story there. And even though Ferrari still has this historic rose-tinted glasses glow about them, the clown memes and the constant struggle of the last couple of decades has certainly taken the shine off the prestige that they leverage as a motivator for people to accept these trade-offs. And this is not something that Fred Vasseur can fix in 3 seasons. Think of it this way. It took Jean Todt 8 years to win a Constructors' Championship with Ferrari, and it was only really after Ross Brawn joined that they became genuine competitors. I mean, sure, they came second in '96, but they were absolutely demolished by Williams thanks largely to 15 retirements and a reliability-related DNS. In his second season at the helm, Vasseur was within 14 points of taking that title, and it went right down to the last race of the year. Did he make a mistake with completely changing the car this year? Well, if that was primarily his decision, then yeah, I think he did. But then I imagine there were a number of factors that went into that, and the fact that Lewis Hamilton was joining the team probably had at least a little bit to do with it. Rather than continuing to cycle through team principles in the hopes that one of them one day might make a miracle happen or magically all of the other teams the bed, then they need to instead look at the internal baked-in challenges being a team with such a national identity creates and start asking themselves if they need to change how they do things. But then also, let's be real. This is a company who won't allow their car owners to give their own possessions a paint job. I genuinely hope that this ever-escalating rumour about the Ferrari top job doesn't come to fruition, but I'm not holding out much hope. And speaking of holding out hope, I'm still hanging on in there with my dream to hit 1,000 subscribers by my channel's 2nd birthday on August 21st. So if you are enjoying this video, then please consider clicking that subscribe button and make sure you give it a like as well so that YouTube knows to put my videos in places where you might actually see them. If you're the kind of person who likes to support creators on Patreon, then you can find the link down in the description and also just right here on the screen. And thank you so much to my patrons up here in the corner. You guys are awesome. Finally, and this is the big one, this race demonstrated how there is still a long way to go with refining penalties and making them appropriate for the offence relative to others. That and some of what the FIA says about them is frankly just bullshit. As is constantly reinforced, the outcome and impact of an incident is not supposed to influence the penalty that the driver deemed to be responsible receives. However, it's difficult to argue that this is what's actually going on when Lando Norris received basically what amounts to a slap on the wrist with a wet bus ticket, despite the fact that he drove into the back of his teammate at 300 kilometers an hour and received no penalty points, even though collisions in every other instance so far this year have resulted in super license penalties for every other driver deemed responsible for a collision incident. Jack Doohan, Liam Lawson, Max Verstappen and Lance Stroll have all run afoul of the rules, and Stroll also got slapped with points for his collision with Leclerc at the hairpin in FP2 in Monaco. Norris, in contrast, got a 5-second penalty that was added to his time post-race and nothing else. No grid drop because he'd completed enough of the race distance to be classified. No points on his super license. Basically, a big fat nothing, despite it being a self-admitted egregious misjudgment on his part. And when you read the official FIA decision document, it's even more clear that this concept of collision impact not affecting penalty outcomes is just flat out untrue. The document reads the following. While Car 4 sustained damage and retired from the race, but was nonetheless classified in the results, Car 81 was not damaged. The stewards determined that the driver of Car 4 was solely to blame for the collision. Because the collision had no immediate and obvious sporting consequences, we imposed a 5-second post-race time penalty on Car 4. Right, okay. Contrast that with the similar incident that happened earlier between Lance Stroll and Pierre Gasly on the entry of turn 13. Now this is where Gasly had his rear wheels alongside Stroll as Stroll was moving to the left to open up the corner. Gasly kept his foot in, which he had the right to do according to the rules and based on where his front wheels were in comparison to Stroll's car, and he ended up with 2 of those wheels on the grass, and Stroll received a 10-second time penalty and 2 super license points for his troubles. Now, I'm not arguing that Lance Stroll shouldn't have received a penalty for this move. Yes, he was on the racing line and he certainly wasn't doing anything unusual or unexpected. However, he has mirrors and he should have been aware that Gasly was right there next to his rear left. The issue I have is that forcing a driver off track is now a slam dunk 10-second penalty, and it can net you a couple of super license points. Yet a very similar incident that does result in a collision can come with a less severe penalty and no lasting impact. All apparently because you only hurt your own car and your own race. Never mind the fact that Lando Norris is an extremely experienced driver at this point and he should have known better. Never mind the fact that it could have been much worse if his front wing had caused Piastri an immediate puncture. And I'm not shitting on Lando here because I like him and I think he's a great driver, but this is a mistake that he made that should have been punished more severely. By colliding with another car, you're still putting both drivers at risk regardless of whether or not you own up to it being your fault, regardless of whether or not it's your teammate, and regardless of if you only screwed up your own race. Just please somebody make it make sense. Penalties exist not only for fairness, but also for fucking safety. I think it's also time that we revisit this idea of classification determined by race distance completed, because giving someone who didn't take the checkered flag a 5-second penalty just because the incident happened in the last few laps of the race is stupid. And yeah, you might argue that this would make those last lap battles less exciting with drivers willing to take fewer risks in the fear of a grid drop, but considering we still see regular impeding in just about every second quali and that's not really in the heat of battle, I don't buy into that argument. Rather than added time, an unserved penalty should result in a 3-place position drop for the race, a grid drop for the next race if that driver doesn't finish regardless of whether or not they're classified, and if the driver responsible is already so far toward the back that last on track is fewer than those 3 places, any remaining should be carried over to the next Grand Prix start. I have talked about this before in a past video and I still stand by it. So that's my 3 conclusions from the 2025 Canadian Grand Prix. What are yours? Do you think the idea of George Russell being a genuine threat for the title is ridiculous? Are you a Fred Vasseur hater? And if yes, please explain. I am genuinely listening. And if you think that the current penalty system and how it's applied are fine actually, then there's a poll link down in the description for that one. If you'd like to hear more of me talking about decision making within the FIA, then click on this video right here. Otherwise, thanks for watching to the end and I'll see you next time. I had an extremely happy father-in-law this morning.